He simply walked up to an ATM to withdraw some money, but it was completely covered in ants. When the machine was opened, everyone was shocked by what they found inside. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The man had learned, over many years, to think of money not as something that promised comfort or ambition, but as a thin line separating order from chaos. He did not chase it, did not romanticize it, did not imagine it multiplying into something grand. He measured it carefully, counted it twice, and assigned it tasks the way other people assigned hope. Rent first, utilities next. Food calculated down to the last practical choice. Everything else, if there was anything else, waited quietly at the bottom of the list and usually remained there. He was a black man in a city that rarely noticed people like him unless they caused a problem or became one. His life had passed without spectacle. He worked a job that demanded reliability more than brilliance, consistency more than recognition. Each day followed the next with only minor variations, and he accepted that rhythm because it was predictable, and predictability was a form of safety. He had long ago stopped expecting sudden turns in fortune. He believed instead in managing what already existed. That evening, winter had tightened its grip on the city. The cold was not dramatic, not theatrical, but thorough. It slipped into seams and corners, settled into metal and concrete, and stayed there. Snow had fallen earlier in the day, not enough to beautify anything, only enough to dull edges and muffle sound. The sidewalks were stiff with ice residue, the streetlights cast pale reflections on the ground, and the air carried the dry, brittle smell that came only when the temperature had remained below freezing long enough to erase moisture from memory. He stepped out of his apartment with his collar raised and his hands already deep in his pockets. The amount he needed to withdraw was small, specific, and unavoidable. A bill was due in the morning, one that could not be postponed without consequence. The timing irritated him, but irritation did not change facts. He had waited until evening because the day had been long and because the bank during daylight hours meant lines, questions, and the subtle exhaustion of being seen and assessed. At night, the machines were silent, impartial, and quick. The bank branch stood 2 blocks away, a low concrete building that looked identical to dozens of others scattered throughout the city. Its windows were dark, its interior locked down, its presence reduced to the single illuminated ATM embedded in the outer wall. That machine had served him dozens of times without incident. He trusted it in the way people trusted things that had never given them a reason not to. As he approached, he noticed movement where movement should not have been. At first, his mind rejected it. The cold alone made the idea unreasonable. His eyes adjusted, focusing more carefully, and what he saw caused him to slow his pace without fully understanding why. The ATM was covered. Not splashed, not smeared, but covered in a way that suggested intention. The screen, the keypad, the card slot, the area around the cash dispenser, all of it crawled with small, dark shapes. They moved constantly, flowing over one another, disappearing into seams and reappearing along edges. Even from several steps away, the density of them was unmistakable. Ants. The word formed in his mind and immediately collided with the temperature. Ants did not exist like this in winter. They did not move with purpose across exposed metal while snow lingered on the ground and frost bit at the air. They hid. They waited. They did not gather. He stopped completely, standing just outside the glow of the ATM's light. His breath fogged in front of his face as he stared. The longer he looked, the more wrong it became. There were too many of them. They were too active. They were not scattered or frantic, but organized, moving in overlapping paths that converged on specific areas of the machine. For a brief moment, he wondered if exhaustion had finally begun to interfere with his perception. Long hours and constant vigilance could do that, he knew. They could create details where none existed. He blinked slowly, deliberately, then looked again. Nothing changed. The ants continued their steady motion, indifferent to his presence, indifferent to the cold, indifferent to reason. They moved across the metal surface as if it were warm ground in summer, as if the machine were not an object but a place. He took one cautious step closer. The light revealed more detail, more certainty. They coated the ATM in layers, crawling over the embossed instructions, filling the grooves between buttons, slipping into the narrow slit where cards were inserted. The sight triggered an instinctive discomfort deep in his chest, something primitive and immediate. This was not merely strange, it was invasive. He did not touch the machine. He did not attempt to brush them away or test whether they would scatter. His body made the decision for him before his thoughts could catch up. He stepped back instead, shaking his head slightly, as if that small motion might reorder reality into something sensible. There were explanations, he told himself. Someone could have spilled something sweet. A nearby trash bin might have attracted them. The building could have a problem unrelated to the ATM itself. Cities were messy, and machines existed within that mess. It did not need to mean anything more than inconvenience. But even as he listed these possibilities, they failed to settle him. None accounted for the season, none explained the focus. The ants ignored the sidewalk, the base of the wall, the door to the bank. Everything about their movement pointed inward toward the machine. He stood there longer than he intended, the cold creeping through his coat, his fingers stiffening inside his pockets. Finally, he turned away. He could not withdraw money tonight, not from that machine. He would have to find another location or adjust his plans. The annoyance returned, familiar and manageable, but it carried a thin edge of unease that he could not fully dismiss. As he walked home, he glanced back once. The ATM glowed steadily in the dark, unchanged, its surface alive with motion. The image followed him the rest of the way, lingering even after he closed his apartment door behind him and locked it. That night, sleep did not come easily. He lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the building, replaying the sight in his mind with unwanted clarity. The ants appeared again and again behind his closed eyes, their paths intersecting, their presence defying the logic he depended on. Eventually, exhaustion won, but even then his rest was shallow, fragmented by half-formed dreams of movement where there should have been stillness. Morning arrived gray and cold. The bill remained due. Practicality reasserted itself. Whatever had happened the night before, he told himself, would likely be gone by daylight. Someone would have cleaned it. Cold would have done its work. Machines did not attract ants in winter, and cities corrected their small abnormalities quickly, often without anyone noticing. By late afternoon, he found himself walking back toward the bank again. The sky had darkened early, as it did in winter, and the temperature had not risen enough to soften anything. His steps slowed as he approached, not from fear, but from an unspoken reluctance to confirm what he already suspected. The ATM was still covered. If anything, there were more ants now. The mass of them seemed thicker, their movement more pronounced, as if time had not diminished them but invited reinforcements. They traced the same paths, converging on the same points, flowing into the same narrow openings. He stopped at the same distance as before, his stomach tightening. This was no longer a momentary inconvenience. This was persistence. A few people passed nearby, their attention fixed on their phones or the ground ahead. None of them stopped. None reacted. The world continued as if nothing unusual were happening, and that fact unsettled him more than the ants themselves. He stood there, a quiet figure in the cold, staring at a machine overtaken by life where life should not have been. He did not know it yet, but this moment marked the beginning of something that would move far beyond his need for cash, beyond the bank, beyond the street itself. For now, he only knew that the ordinary rules he relied on had failed, and that the machine he trusted had become something else entirely. He turned away once more, carrying with him the certainty that whatever was happening had not finished revealing itself. The certainty that something was wrong did not announce itself loudly. It settled instead, quietly, in the space between thought and instinct, where explanations were usually assembled and then dismissed. After leaving the bank for the second time, the man carried that certainty with him through the evening, through dinner eaten without appetite, through the slow hours that followed. He did not speak about what he had seen, not because he feared disbelief, but because saying it aloud would require him to give it shape and meaning. As long as it remained unspoken, it could still be treated as an anomaly rather than the beginning of a pattern. Sleep came later than usual. When it did, it was shallow and uneasy, filled with images that repeated themselves without variation. The glowing rectangle of the ATM appeared again and again, its surface alive with motion. The ants did not behave like creatures in a dream, shifting or distorting. They moved exactly as they had in reality, methodical, concentrated, indifferent. When he woke, the impression lingered with unsettling clarity, as though his mind had been rehearsing something it would need later. Morning brought no relief. The city looked as it always did in winter, functional and restrained. People moved quickly, conserving warmth and attention. Nothing in the daylight suggested that the previous night had been anything other than ordinary. The bill remained unpaid, his options narrowed with each hour. By the time late afternoon arrived, the decision to return to the bank had already been made, though he would not have described it as a choice. It felt closer to obligation, to the gravity that pulled him back toward something unresolved. He told himself that he would not linger, that he would simply confirm whether the situation had changed, and then move on to find another ATM if necessary. As he walked, the cold pressed harder than it had the day before. The temperature had dropped just enough to make breathing sting. Snow that had softened slightly during daylight hours had refrozen into a slick, unyielding surface. The city had retreated inward, lights glowing behind windows, the street quieter than usual. When the bank came into view, his pace slowed without conscious intent. The light from the ATM reached out into the dusk, and before he was close enough to see a detail, he already knew what awaited him. The anticipation was not dramatic. It was heavy, weighted by the expectation that confirmation would bring consequences he did not yet understand. The ants were still there. They covered the machine in the same dense, restless mass, crawling over one another, disappearing into seams and emerging again. The cold had not reduced their numbers or dulled their activity. If anything, they appeared more numerous, their movement more assertive. The sight struck him with a sharp, immediate clarity. This was not residual. This was not chance. He stood and watched longer this time. The discomfort he felt was tempered by a growing need to understand, or at least to observe. He noticed details he had missed before. The ants did not wander aimlessly. Their paths were repeated, reinforced by constant traffic. Certain areas of the ATM drew them more strongly than others. The card slot, the seam around the display, the narrow gap beneath the keypad where plastic met metal. They flowed toward these points with quiet insistence. A few ventured outward, testing the surrounding surface, but most remained anchored to the machine itself. The sidewalk around the ATM was nearly clear. The wall of the bank, though close, held little interest for them. Their focus was precise. He shifted his weight, careful not to step too close. The ants did not react to his movement. They did not scatter or retreat. They behaved as if he were irrelevant, as if the machine alone mattered. That indifference unsettled him more than aggression would have. Other people passed by. Some glanced briefly at the ATM, registering the movement without fully processing it. Others did not look at all. No one stopped. No one asked questions. The city's collective habit of ignoring what did not immediately demand attention was on full display. The man felt oddly separated from it, as though he had crossed an invisible threshold into awareness that others refused to acknowledge. He considered taking out his phone, documenting the scene, but the impulse faded quickly. Images would not capture the wrongness of it. They would flatten the experience, turn it into something easily dismissed. He needed something more concrete, though he did not yet know what that might be. Eventually, practicality asserted itself again. He still needed cash. The ants had made this machine unusable, but the city was not limited to one bank. He turned away and walked several blocks farther, finding another ATM attached to a grocery store. That machine functioned normally, its surface cold and lifeless, exactly as it should be. He withdrew the amount he needed and felt a brief, hollow sense of relief. On his way home, however, his thoughts returned to the first ATM with persistent insistence. The contrast between the two machines sharpened the strangeness of what he had witnessed. One was inert, obedient to the rules he understood. The other had become something else, a focal point for living movement in a season defined by dormancy. Over the next day, he found his attention drawn repeatedly to the bank's location. Each time he passed nearby, he slowed, glancing toward the ATM. Each time, the ants were there. The bank appeared to have taken notice at last. A temporary sign was posted, apologizing for inconvenience and stating that the machine was undergoing maintenance. The ants ignored the sign entirely. He watched as a worker arrived with cleaning equipment, spraying chemicals across the surface, wiping it down with brisk, practiced motions. For a brief moment, the machine looked normal again. The ants scattered, retreating into cracks in the sidewalk or disappearing beneath the wall. The worker left satisfied. Less than an hour later, the ants returned. They emerged from every direction, converging once more on the ATM with the same unwavering focus. The chemical smell did nothing to deter them. The cold did nothing to slow them. It was as if something inside the machine itself was calling them back. That realization settled heavily in the man's mind. The problem was not external. It was not spilled soda or discarded food. It was not the environment around the ATM. Whatever drew the ants was part of the machine. He found himself lingering longer each time he visited, watching the patterns of movement, noting how the ants behaved as the evening grew colder and the machine continued to operate. When someone attempted to use it before the bank fully shut it down, the screen's warmth seemed to intensify the activity. The ants clustered more tightly, their movement quickening in response. Without intending to, the man became a constant presence near the bank. He did not interfere. He did not speak to anyone. He observed. His face appeared again and again in the bank's exterior security footage, a silent witness returning at regular intervals. He was not aware of this at the time. He only knew that leaving the situation unobserved felt like abandoning something unfinished. As days passed, his initial unease evolved into a deeper, more troubling understanding. This was not a one-time malfunction. It was a condition. The ATM had become a point of attraction, a site where something unseen was actively interacting with the world. The ants were responding to a signal that persisted regardless of human intervention. The bank eventually took stronger measures. The machine was powered down. Its lights went dark. A barrier was placed around it to prevent use. Even then, the ants remained, crawling across the inactive surface, probing its seams as though expecting something to return. Standing across the street one evening, watching the darkened ATM continue to pulse with life, the man felt a shift within himself. What had begun as an inconvenience had transformed into a certainty that this situation would not resolve quietly. Something fundamental had gone wrong, and the ants were only the most visible symptom. He did not yet know how deeply this anomaly would reach, or how many systems it would expose. He only knew that the machine was no longer just a machine, and that his return to it, driven by necessity, had bound him to whatever came next. Once the bank finally disabled the ATM, the street around it began to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. What had once been a place of brief functional stops became a location people skirted instinctively, even if they could not articulate why. The barrier placed around the machine was temporary and light, more symbolic than effective, but it marked the spot as different. The glow was gone now. The screen remained dark. The familiar electronic hum had ceased, yet the absence of activity from the machine did nothing to restore a sense of normalcy. The ants remained. They did not disperse when the ATM powered down, nor did they lose interest when its warmth faded. They continued to gather on the cold surface, tracing the same invisible routes, pressing themselves into the same seams and openings as before. Their persistence redefined the situation. What had initially seemed like a reaction to heat or motion now appeared independent of both. The machine, even inert, still held whatever drew them. The man noticed the shift in atmosphere immediately. He came by in the early evening, as he had begun to do almost unconsciously, and found himself standing longer than usual across the street. Without the light of the ATM, the ants were harder to see from a distance, but up close their presence was undeniable. They formed dark, moving constellations against the pale casing, a living layer that refused to acknowledge the machine's shutdown. He realized then that the situation had moved beyond maintenance. This was no longer a technical inconvenience. It was a transformation. People who passed by now noticed it more often, if only briefly. A glance lingered, a step slowed. Some frowned, others shook their heads, but most continued on, choosing not to engage. A few pulled out phones to take pictures, standing just long enough to capture proof before retreating. None stayed. The man stayed. He could not have explained why, not even to himself. It was not curiosity in the conventional sense, nor was it fear. It was closer to responsibility, though he had not been assigned one. He had seen the beginning of this anomaly, and that fact alone tethered him to its progression. Over time, he began to recognize patterns not only in the ants, but in the human response as well. The ants behaved with consistency, reinforcing their paths, adjusting density as conditions changed, but never abandoning the machine. The people behaved with avoidance, treating the ATM as a minor inconvenience rather than an unresolved problem. Both responses followed instinct, and neither addressed the underlying cause. The bank escalated its response slowly. First came additional cleaning attempts, more aggressive chemicals applied by workers wearing gloves and masks. The ants scattered temporarily, retreating into cracks in the pavement, into the base of the wall, into places unseen. Within hours, sometimes less, they returned. The workers grew visibly unsettled, their efficiency giving way to caution. No one liked touching the machine anymore. Next came signage warning customers to use other locations. Then came tape sealing off the immediate area. The machine itself remained untouched, its casing intact, its internal systems silent. The ants treated these measures as irrelevant obstacles, crawling beneath tape, around barriers, reclaiming their territory with quiet determination. The man watched it all unfold. His presence had become habitual enough that some of the bank staff recognized him, though no one spoke to him. He did not ask questions. He did not offer explanations. He simply observed, absorbing details others overlooked. He noticed how the ants reacted to subtle environmental changes. When the sun struck the wall briefly in the afternoon, their movement intensified in certain areas. When snow fell and melted against the base of the building, they adjusted their routes but did not leave. When the wind picked up, they clustered tighter against the machine, as if shielding something. He began to understand that this was not random infestation. This was occupation. The ATM, stripped of its function, had become a focal point, a node where something unseen continued to assert itself. The ants behaved as if the machine were a resource worth defending, worth returning to despite repeated disruption. They were not confused. They were committed. That realization disturbed him more deeply than the sheer number of insects ever had. One evening, as he stood watching from his usual position, a maintenance truck pulled up beside the bank. This time, the crew did not bring cleaning supplies. They brought tools, heavy ones, the kind used for removal rather than repair. The man felt a tightening in his chest as the workers approached the ATM with deliberate caution. They wore thicker gloves now, heavier jackets, their movements slower, more measured. The ants crawled over their equipment without hesitation, indifferent to the human's presence. The barrier was removed. The casing was examined. One worker pressed gently against the machine's surface, then withdrew his hand as if surprised by the sensation. Another leaned closer, frowning. The man could not hear their words from where he stood, but he saw their expressions shift from mild annoyance to concern. When they attempted to tilt the machine forward, the resistance caught them off guard. It moved, but not easily. Something about its internal weight distribution seemed wrong, as if the balance had changed over time. As the ATM was slowly detached from its mounting, the ants reacted. Their movement intensified, patterns tightening, streams converging on the seams where the casing met the wall. The man felt a strange surge of anticipation, though he did not yet know what it meant. The machine was finally freed and loaded onto a wheeled platform. As it moved away from the wall, the ants followed, spilling across the pavement, refusing to abandon it. The sight was unsettling, a living mass trailing behind an object that should have meant nothing to them. Even when the ATM was rolled into the truck, the ants clung to it, disappearing into the darkness of the cargo area. The workers hesitated, exchanging looks, but completed the task. The doors closed. The truck drove away. For a moment, the sidewalk seemed suddenly empty. The ants that had spilled onto the ground scattered, searching briefly before retreating into cracks and crevices. The wall of the bank was bare, marked only by discoloration where the machine had been. People resumed passing by more normally. The street exhaled as if relieved. The man remained where he was, staring at the empty space. He felt no relief. Instead, a deeper unease settled in. The removal of the machine had not resolved anything. It had merely relocated the problem. He understood with growing certainty that whatever had drawn the ants had not been addressed. It had simply been taken elsewhere, carried intact into a space where fewer eyes would see it. As he turned to leave, the cold pressing harder against his face, he felt the weight of that knowledge follow him. The machine had been taken over long before anyone noticed, and now, wherever it was headed, the consequences would continue to unfold, unseen, until something forced them into view again. He did not yet know that the next stage of the story would not happen on the street, but behind closed doors, under bright lights, where the machine would finally be opened and examined. But even now, as he walked away from the empty wall, he sensed that the silence was temporary, and that what lay inside the machine was waiting to be revealed. The place where the machine was taken did not resemble the street it had left behind. There were no passers-by, no dim glow from a screen reflecting off wet pavement, no casual indifference to soften what was about to happen. The facility sat on the edge of an industrial district where buildings were designed for function alone. Concrete walls absorbed sound. Fluorescent lights erased shadow. Everything inside existed to be inspected, measured, classified. The ATM arrived late in the evening, unloaded with the same careful hesitation that had marked its removal. The ants were still there. They clung to the casing as if the journey had changed nothing, their movement uninterrupted by distance or confinement. Even as the machine was wheeled into the inspection bay, they traced their familiar paths, slipping into seams, emerging again along the edges. The technicians paused more than once, watching them. No one spoke at first. There was an unspoken recognition that whatever this was, it had exceeded the boundaries of routine malfunction. The machine was placed beneath bright overhead lights, its surface exposed in unforgiving clarity. The ants seemed almost more visible here, their dark bodies stark against the pale casing. One of the technicians reached out and pressed a gloved hand lightly against the side of the machine. The reaction was immediate. He withdrew his hand and stared at the glove, flexing his fingers as if reassessing the sensation. The surface was warmer than expected. Not hot, not even noticeably heated by any obvious source, but wrong. A machine that had been powered down for days should have been cold, fully equilibrated with the surrounding air. This one was not. That observation shifted the atmosphere in the room. The technicians exchanged looks, their movements growing more deliberate. Tools were gathered. Documentation began. The machine was photographed from every angle. The ants captured in frame as evidence rather than nuisance. As the casing screws were loosened, the ants reacted again. Their movement intensified, streams converging toward the seams being disturbed. They did not scatter in panic. They pressed closer, as though the act of opening the machine confirmed something they had already known. When the outer panel finally came away, the smell emerged. It was faint at first, barely perceptible beneath the sterile odor of the facility, but unmistakably out of place. Sweet. Not the sharp sweetness of chemicals or solvents, but something organic, rounded, almost warm. It did not belong inside a financial machine, and its presence drew immediate attention. The technicians leaned in despite themselves. Inside the casing, beneath layers of wiring and insulation, there was moisture. Not condensation from temperature difference, but residue. A thin, glossy film coated certain internal surfaces, catching the light in a way that suggested viscosity rather than water. The ants surged inward. They poured into the exposed interior with sudden urgency, following channels invisible to human eyes. Their behavior, which had seemed merely persistent before, now appeared purposeful. They moved directly toward specific components, clustering along plastic housings and cable sheaths, ignoring metal entirely. The technicians stepped back, startled by the shift. The machine was no longer simply infested. It was active. Careful containment measures were put in place. The ants were gently displaced where possible, their paths interrupted but not erased. Each attempt to clear a section revealed more residue, more evidence that something inside the ATM had been slowly changing long before anyone noticed. As layers were peeled back, the structure of the machine began to tell a story. The plastic components that formed its internal insulation were subtly altered. They were softer than specification allowed, their surfaces marred by microfractures that radiated outward like stress lines. When pressure was applied, they yielded slightly, releasing more of the faintly sweet scent. Samples were taken, sealed, labeled. Under magnification, the material revealed its compromise. The plastic was not pure. Embedded within it were traces of organic compounds dispersed unevenly, trapped during the manufacturing process and never fully neutralized. The realization settled slowly, heavily. This was not contamination that had entered the machine after installation. This was not vandalism or accident. The flaw was foundational. The ants, it became clear, had not invaded the machine. They had discovered it. As the inspection continued, the source of the warmth was identified. The organic material within the plastic responded to even minimal operational heat, altering its structure at a microscopic level. Over time, friction and ambient warmth had caused it to migrate, to move through the plastic's porous weaknesses. It did not flow freely, but it did not remain still either. It seeped. The residue found inside the machine was not a spill. It was an exudate. When the ATM had been operational, the warmth generated by its electronics had accelerated the process. The sweet compounds had been drawn outward, slowly reaching the surface through cracks too small to be seen by the naked eye. The machine had, quite literally, been sweating. Outside, on the street, that invisible signal had been enough. The ants' presence was no longer mysterious. Their persistence was no longer surprising. They had responded to a consistent, localized source of organic scent in an environment otherwise stripped of such cues by winter. To them, the machine had represented abundance, stability, a viable resource worth returning to again and again. Inside the facility, the implications expanded rapidly. This ATM was not unique in its design. It was part of a production run, manufactured using materials sourced through a recycling program intended to reduce costs and environmental impact. The plastic components had been produced from reclaimed material, processed, blended, and molded to specification. Somewhere in that chain, organic residues had survived. The technicians documented everything with growing urgency. Reports were drafted, preliminary alerts sent. The ants were no longer the focus. They had become evidence. As the machine was fully opened, its internal state confirmed what the initial findings suggested. The contamination was not superficial. It permeated the insulation, the housings, the non-conductive supports. Over time, it had compromised not only the structural integrity of the components, but their electrical isolation as well. The sweetness that had drawn the ants was only the most visible symptom. Beneath it lay the potential for far more serious consequences. By the time the inspection concluded, the room felt smaller. The machine sat disassembled under the lights, stripped of mystery but heavy with implication. The ants had been removed, contained, documented, but their role in the story was already complete. They had led humans to a problem that had been hiding in plain sight. The machine was sealed for further analysis, its components packaged separately for testing. Outside the facility, the night was as cold and quiet as ever. The street where the ATM had once stood remained empty, its absence barely noticed by those who passed. The man who had first seen the ants did not know what was happening inside the inspection bay. He did not know that the machine was being opened, that its internal failure was being mapped in detail. He only knew that something he had witnessed out of necessity had been taken seriously at last. The opening of the machine marked a transition. What had been an anomaly was now an investigation. What had been a local inconvenience was becoming something larger, something that would not remain contained within a single facility or a single report. The ATM had been opened, and in doing so, it had exposed a vulnerability that could no longer be ignored. The answers did not arrive all at once. They emerged slowly, layered, reluctant, as though the system itself resisted being fully understood. Once the machine had been opened and its internal condition documented, the focus shifted from what had happened to how it could have happened at all. The ATM, stripped of its casing and reduced to labeled components, was no longer an object of mystery but a source of questions that reached far beyond the inspection facility. Samples of the compromised plastic were sent to multiple laboratories. Each lab approached the material differently, applying chemical analysis, thermal stress testing, and microscopic imaging. What they found confirmed the technicians' initial suspicions and deepened them. The plastic was not merely contaminated on the surface. It had been altered at the molecular level. Organic compounds were embedded throughout its structure, unevenly distributed, bonded in ways that suggested incomplete processing rather than external exposure. The reports began to align. The compounds were sugars, stabilizers, and trace elements commonly found in industrial food syrups. Not residue in the casual sense, but remnants of something that had once been present in large quantity. The material had been exposed to it before being molded, before being shaped into the components now sitting under harsh laboratory lights. The investigation traced the supply chain backward, step by careful step. The ATM manufacturer had not produced its own plastic. It sourced non-conductive components from a third-party supplier specializing in recycled polymers. That supplier, in turn, acquired raw material from regional recycling facilities, where plastic waste from multiple industries was collected, sorted, processed, and blended. The system was efficient by design. It was also vulnerable. At one facility, months before the ATM had ever been installed on the street, a batch of plastic containers from a food processing plant had entered the recycling stream. These containers had once held concentrated syrup used in beverage production. Though they had been cleaned to regulatory standards, trace amounts of syrup had remained, absorbed into the plastic itself. During reprocessing, those containers were shredded, melted, and mixed with other plastic waste. Under ideal conditions, the high temperatures involved would have broken down any remaining organic compounds. But ideal conditions were expensive. Energy costs fluctuated, throughput targets loomed, equipment aged, a marginal reduction in temperature, a shortened processing cycle, a calibration slightly out of tolerance, and the organic residues survived. They did not remain liquid. They did not remain mobile. They became part of the material. The recycled plastic was pelletized, shipped, and molded into ATM components with no outward indication of flaw. To the manufacturer, it met specifications. It passed strength tests. It functioned as intended under standard operating conditions. Nothing in the existing quality control process was designed to detect organic inclusions at such low concentrations. The mistake was not dramatic. It was procedural. As the reports circulated, the narrative of the ATM began to change. It was no longer a single defective unit. It was a representative sample of a broader issue, one that had been quietly replicated across production runs. The same recycled plastic had been used in hundreds, possibly thousands of machines installed in similar environments. The ants had not discovered a rare anomaly. They had encountered a pattern. Within the plastic, the organic compounds behaved predictably over time. Under repeated cycles of mild heating and cooling, they migrated toward areas of lower resistance. Microfractures formed where the plastic flexed or aged. Through those pathways, the compounds reached the surface, emerging as a thin, nearly invisible film. To humans, it was negligible. To ants, it was unmistakable. The sweetness was not strong. It did not announce itself. It lingered. As engineers reviewed the data, and they began to recognize the secondary effects that had gone unnoticed. The presence of organic material altered the electrical insulation properties of the plastic. Moisture retention increased slightly, but consistently. Over years of operation, this could reduce the effective separation between conductive elements. The risk was not immediate failure, but gradual degradation. The ATM on the street had been close to that threshold. The ants' attraction had drawn attention before more serious consequences could manifest. In another environment, without visible indicators, the same flaw might have remained hidden until a short circuit, a fire, or a data breach forced discovery under far worse circumstances. As the investigation expanded, the man who had first noticed the ants appeared again, indirectly, in the documentation. Security footage confirmed his repeated presence. Incident reports referenced an initial observation by a customer. His name was included, noted without emphasis, a factual detail rather than a headline. He did not know this yet. He continued his routine, returning to normal banking locations, moving through the city with the same measured attention he had always practiced. But something in him had shifted. He found himself paying closer attention to small inconsistencies, to patterns others overlooked. Once noticed, it was difficult to return fully to unseeing. The findings reached regulatory agencies, manufacturers, and industry groups almost simultaneously. What began as a localized anomaly became a case study in systemic oversight. The drive toward sustainability and cost reduction had outpaced the mechanisms designed to ensure long-term safety. No single decision had caused the problem. It had emerged from alignment, from cumulative compromise. Meetings were held, models were revised, risk assessments were updated. The language used in reports grew more cautious, more deliberate. The ants were mentioned only briefly as an external indicator. The focus remained on materials science, on process control, on standards that would need to change. Yet, beneath all of it lay a quieter truth. The system had been blind to its own vulnerability until a biological response revealed it. A living organism had detected what sensors and inspections had not. By the time the origin of the mistake was fully understood, the scope of its implications had become impossible to contain. The ATM that had once stood unnoticed on a winter street had become a reference point, a marker for a failure that extended far beyond a single machine. The next question was no longer how the mistake had happened, but how much time had passed before it was noticed, and what else might already be compromised as a result. Once the origin of the flaw was established, the investigation entered a quieter and more troubling phase. The urgency that had driven the initial disassembly and analysis gave way to a slower, more meticulous reckoning. Understanding how the mistake had occurred answered only one part of the question. The more difficult task lay in determining what the mistake had been allowed to become. Engineers and analysts began to model scenarios rather than examine objects. The compromised plastic, now stripped of its anonymity, was subjected to simulations that projected its behavior over time. Heat cycles were repeated in accelerated sequences. Electrical loads were applied under varying humidity conditions. The results were consistent, and they were unsettling. The presence of organic material, even in trace amounts, altered the long-term stability of insulation in ways that were subtle but cumulative. No single test produced catastrophic failure. Instead, each revealed incremental loss of resistance, slight increases in moisture absorption, minute shifts in thermal response. Individually, these changes were within tolerances. Together, over years of operation, they converged toward risk. The ATM from the street had not failed electrically. It had not sparked or overheated. It had not corrupted data or shut down unexpectedly. It had simply begun to signal its internal condition through a channel no one had thought to monitor. The ants had responded to chemistry. The system had responded to numbers. That discrepancy haunted the review process. As more data came in, the scope widened. The same recycled polymer blend had been used not only in ATMs, but in other electronic enclosures designed under similar assumptions of inertness. Kiosks, payment terminals, access control panels. Anywhere insulation was expected to remain passive over long periods, the same vulnerability could exist. The danger lay not in immediate malfunction, but in delayed consequence. Electrical systems relied on margins of safety that eroded quietly. Moisture trapped within altered plastic did not announce itself. It condensed, migrated, accumulated. Over time, it could bridge gaps that had once been sufficient. The difference between safe operation and failure narrowed until it depended on conditions that could not be easily predicted. A power surge, an unusually warm day, a fault elsewhere in the system. In controlled environments, these factors were mitigated. In public spaces exposed to weather, usage patterns, and neglect, they aligned unpredictably. The ATM on the street had been fortunate, in a way that felt perverse. Its flaw had manifested as sweetness rather than flame. As the models grew more complex, so did the implications. Regulatory thresholds that had been considered conservative were revealed to be optimistic. Inspection intervals designed around visible wear failed to account for internal chemical migration. The standards that govern recycled materials emphasize strength and composition at the point of manufacture, not behavior across decades. The realization produced a kind of institutional discomfort. The industry prided itself on foresight, on anticipating failure modes before they reached the public. Yet, here was a failure that had existed invisibly within approved specifications. The ants had not exploited a weakness. They had illuminated it. Meetings extended late into the night. Reports grew longer, their language more cautious. Terms like acceptable risk and unlikely scenario appeared with increasing frequency, hedging conclusions that could not be softened without dishonesty. No one wanted to be responsible for declaring a widespread vulnerability, but no one could convincingly deny it either. In parallel with the technical analysis, quieter discussions took place. What would have happened if the ants had not appeared? If the ATM had been installed in a location less exposed to wildlife, less observed? The answer was uncomfortable in its uncertainty. The machine might have continued operating for years, its internal insulation slowly degrading. A short circuit might have occurred eventually, dismissed as isolated malfunction. A data error might have been blamed on software. A fire, if it happened at all, would have been attributed to wiring. The true cause would likely have remained hidden. That possibility altered the tone of the investigation. The ants were no longer a curiosity. They were a warning that had arrived early enough to be understood. Their presence reframed the narrative from one of defect to one of near miss. The man who had first noticed them remained unaware of the depth of what was unfolding. He continued his routines, his days marked by the same quiet discipline as before. Yet, even without direct knowledge, he sensed that something unresolved lingered beneath the surface of ordinary systems. He found himself pausing longer when machines behaved unexpectedly, when patterns seemed slightly off. The experience had sharpened his attention, though it had not given him answers. Occasionally, he passed the spot where the ATM had once stood. The wall had been repaired, the discoloration painted over. To anyone else, it was an absence quickly forgotten. To him, it was a reminder that the city contained layers of history invisible to those who did not look closely. Within the industry, the debate shifted from analysis to response. The question was no longer whether the flaw posed a risk, but how to address it without creating panic or disruption disproportionate to the evidence. The economic implications were significant. Replacing or retrofitting machines across a wide network would be costly and logistically complex. Doing nothing, however, now carried a risk that could no longer be dismissed as theoretical. The ants had changed the calculus. In the end, what troubled the investigators most was not the specific vulnerability they had uncovered, but the method by which it had been revealed. A living system had detected a failure long before the design safeguards had done so. The instruments had been precise, the models sophisticated, the standards carefully written. Yet none of them had been sensitive to what mattered first. The flaw had announced itself through behavior rather than breakdown. As reports were finalized and recommendations drafted, a consensus began to form. The incident was not merely about recycled plastic or organic contamination. It was about assumptions embedded so deeply within systems that they became invisible. The assumption that materials labeled inert would remain so. The assumption that failure would announce itself dramatically. The assumption that oversight could be fully mechanized. Those assumptions no longer held. The next phase would require action rather than analysis, decisions that would ripple outward into manufacturing lines, regulatory frameworks, and public trust. The risk that had nearly gone unnoticed now demanded acknowledgement. The question was no longer what could have happened if the ants had not appeared. It was what would happen next, now that they had. The decision, when it finally came, did not arrive as a single announcement or dramatic gesture. It emerged through a series of measured actions that, taken together, signaled a shift the industry could not reverse. What had begun as internal concern hardened into coordinated response. Quiet alerts were sent first, framed as precautionary reviews rather than warnings. Manufacturers were asked to identify production runs that matched the material profile of the compromised ATM. Regulators requested documentation that had once been routine and now felt exposed. The reviews uncovered what many had already begun to suspect. The recycled polymer blend traced from the original machine appeared again and again across installation records. Different cities, different climates, different usage patterns. The same underlying assumption repeated with minor variations. The flaw did not announce itself loudly anywhere else, but that absence no longer felt reassuring. It felt temporary. Inspection teams were dispatched with revised protocols. They were instructed not to look for ants, not to wait for visible signs of infestation, but to measure subtler indicators, thermal inconsistencies, microfractures, changes in insulation resistance that would previously have been dismissed as noise. In some machines, the findings mirrored the original case closely. In others, they appeared only as faint trends, early enough to be corrected but undeniable in their direction. As the data accumulated, it became impossible to frame the issue as isolated. The language used in internal memos shifted. Words like anomaly and exception gave way to pattern and exposure. Risk assessments were rewritten. Scenarios once categorized as improbable were reclassified as plausible under specific conditions. Each adjustment carried weight, not just technical but financial. Banks faced a difficult calculus. ATMs were not optional infrastructure. They were points of access, symbols of reliability, expected to function regardless of weather or circumstance. Temporarily disabling them created public frustration. Permanently replacing them demanded resources that had not been allocated. Yet, continuing operation without intervention now carried a documented risk. The response unfolded unevenly. Some institutions acted quickly, announcing inspections and temporary shutdowns framed as upgrades. Others hesitated, weighing cost against probability, hoping their machines would not be among those affected. In a few cities, clusters of ATMs were taken offline simultaneously, their absence suddenly visible. Lines formed at remaining machines. Complaints surfaced. News outlets began asking questions. The story entered public awareness not through technical detail, but through inconvenience. People noticed that familiar machines were unavailable. They noticed signs, citing maintenance, and safety reviews. They noticed the sudden fragility of systems they had never considered before. The explanation followed slowly, filtered through press releases that emphasized precaution rather than danger. When the ants were mentioned, they were treated as a footnote, an oddity, a catalyst. The narrative focused instead on material science, on sustainability efforts that had advanced faster than oversight mechanisms. The public response was mixed. Some praised the commitment to safety. Others questioned why the issue had not been detected sooner. Trust wavered, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Behind the scenes, regulatory bodies moved with greater urgency. Standards governing recycled materials were revised, expanded to include long-term chemical behavior rather than initial composition alone. New testing requirements were proposed, then mandated. Manufacturers were instructed to certify not only what their materials were, but how they would change. The recall, when it came, was unavoidable. It was not universal. Not every machine was affected. But enough were, and enough uncertainty surrounded the remainder, that a broad corrective action became the only defensible choice. Notices were issued, schedules were established. The process stretched over months, disrupting routines in ways both minor and profound. The man who had first noticed the ants encountered the consequences in small, personal ways. ATMs near his home were shut down temporarily. He adjusted, walking farther, waiting longer. He listened as others complained, unaware that the inconvenience traced back to something he had seen and not understood at the time. His role remained invisible, preserved only in documentation few would ever read. Occasionally, he saw news segments covering the issue. Experts spoke calmly, confidently, explaining the measures being taken. Diagrams appeared on screens, simplified representations of complex processes. The story was framed as a success of oversight, a demonstration of systems working as intended. He felt no pride in that framing, nor resentment. What he felt was something quieter, a recognition of how easily the situation might have gone differently, how the warning might have been missed, how close the problem had come to remaining buried within acceptable margins. As replacements were installed, the city slowly returned to normal. New machines appeared, their casings pristine, their materials certified under revised standards. The absence of ants went unnoticed by most. The lesson they had carried was not easily visible. Within the industry, the incident became a reference point. Training materials cited it. Case studies analyzed it. It entered the institutional memory as an example of emergent risk, of failure detected through unexpected channels. It influenced design decisions in subtle ways, shaping how future systems would be evaluated. The chain reaction extended beyond ATMs. Other sectors took note. Recycling processes were audited more rigorously. Cross-industry communication improved, if only incrementally. The assumption that sustainability and safety naturally aligned was replaced with a more cautious understanding of their interaction. For the man, life continued much as it had before. He did not seek recognition. He did not tell the story. Yet something fundamental had changed in how he perceived the world around him. He no longer saw infrastructure as static or self-correcting. He saw it as layered, contingent, dependent on vigilance that was often outsourced and sometimes absent. The recall concluded. The standards changed. The immediate risk receded, but the impact lingered, diffused through systems and habits, altering decisions in ways that would never be traced back to a single winter evening. The ants were gone. The machines were new. The street where it had begun bore no visible mark of what had occurred, only the accumulated responses remained, embedded in processes and policies, shaping outcomes quietly. The chain reaction had run its course, not with an explosion, but with a series of adjustments that redefined what safety meant. And at its origin lay an observation made by someone who had only wanted to withdraw money, and who had paid attention when something ordinary behaved otherwise. When the last of the affected machines was removed and replaced, the city did not mark the moment in any visible way. There was no announcement, no sense of closure that people could point to and recognize as an ending. Life simply resumed its usual rhythm, absorbing the disruption as it always did, smoothing it over until memory blurred into routine. The systems that had faltered were restored, improved, reinforced, and then taken for granted again. For the man, the end revealed itself more quietly. He noticed it one evening while walking home along the same route he had taken countless times before. The bank wall was whole again. The concrete had been patched and repainted, the faint discoloration erased with careful efficiency. Where the ATM had once been embedded, there was now nothing but an uninterrupted surface, flat and unremarkable. No light, no sound, no movement. He stopped without meaning to. The absence felt heavier than the presence ever had during the weeks when the machine had been there, even broken, even overtaken. It had drawn attention simply by existing. It had occupied space in his mind as well as on the street. Now that space was empty, and the emptiness demanded its own kind of reckoning. He stood there longer than anyone passing by would have understood. To them, it was just a wall. To him, it was a place where something invisible had surfaced briefly before being sealed away again, not by neglect, but by correction. The danger had been addressed. The systems had adapted. The story, for all practical purposes, was over. And yet, he thought back to that first night, the way he had slowed without knowing why, the way his body had recognized wrongness before his mind had accepted it. He remembered the cold, the light, the unsettling certainty that something ordinary had slipped its bounds. At the time, he had not known that he was standing at the edge of a larger failure, or that his attention would matter at all. He had only known that the machine did not belong to the rules he trusted. Nothing about his life had changed in any outward, measurable way as a result of what he had witnessed. He had not gained money, status, or recognition. His name had not appeared in articles or interviews. It existed only in reports, buried among timestamps and camera references attached to the phrase "initial observer." A role without ceremony. Yet the experience had left its mark. He no longer passed through the city with the same passive confidence he once had. He noticed patterns now, small irregularities in places designed to be predictable. He noticed how often people relied on systems they did not understand, how easily anomalies were dismissed until they became impossible to ignore. He noticed how much of modern safety depended not on perfection, but on the assumption that flaws would announce themselves in time. The ants had announced it. That thought returned to him often, uninvited but persistent. They had not intended to warn anyone. They had followed instinct, responding to chemistry, to signals far older than machines or standards. In doing so, they had revealed a weakness that had slipped past every formal safeguard. The system had listened only when the signal became visible enough to disrupt routine. He wondered how many other warnings went unnoticed every day because they did not inconvenience anyone yet. The new ATM that eventually replaced the old one stood a short distance away, mounted cleanly, its casing smooth and unblemished. He used it when necessary. It worked as expected. No ants gathered. No sweetness lingered. To anyone else, it represented improvement, progress, the quiet success of corrective action. To him, it represented something more fragile. He understood now that safety was not a fixed condition, but a continuous process, dependent on attention that could not be fully automated or outsourced. Standards could be rewritten, materials improved, inspections expanded, but none of it replaced the need for someone, somewhere, to notice when something ordinary behaved otherwise. On his way home, he resumed walking, leaving the empty wall behind. The city closed around him, indifferent as ever, functioning within margins that shifted invisibly from one day to the next. Lights turned on and off. Machines hummed. People moved through their routines, trusting that the structures supporting them would hold. He did not resent that trust. He shared it to a point, but it was no longer blind. The story of the ants and the ATM would fade into institutional memory, referenced occasionally, then less often, until it became a footnote in training manuals and risk assessments. New problems would arise. New assumptions would be tested. The system would continue its slow, imperfect adaptation. For him, the lesson remained personal and intact. Sometimes, the most important warnings did not come in the form of alarms or failures or dramatic collapse. Sometimes they arrived quietly, crawling across a surface no one expected to look at closely. Sometimes they appeared to the people who were simply present, simply paying attention, simply trying to get through their day. He walked on, hands in his pockets, breath visible in the cold air, carrying with him the knowledge that the world's most significant changes often began in places that, once repaired, left no trace at all. If this story made you stop and think, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, the ones that reveal what hides beneath the ordinary. Watch our other videos to see how small details uncover much bigger truths. And share this video with someone who would never expect a simple moment to change everything.